What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue here with my 2024 college football schedule preview and projected record series. The Kentucky Wildcats are up next before we preview their schedule for 2024 and give them an early projected record based on how tough their schedule is. Let's take a look back at what Kentucky did in 2023. Here were my projections and predictions last year for the Kentucky Wildcats. My projection had them at 5-7, and then my prediction for this team was 7-5. So I did have a difference there with my projection and prediction for this team last year. Kentucky did, of course, go 7-5 in the regular season, and then 7-6 overall if you count their bowl game loss at the end of the year in 2023. But again, a 7-5 record last year for the Kentucky Wildcats. I was right on the money with their prediction last year, but not on the money with their projection just because of how tough the schedule was last year for Kentucky. Here was that schedule for the Wildcats last year in 2023. You look at their non-conference schedule, had a pretty favorable non-conference schedule, played Ball State, Eastern Kentucky, and Akron to start out the year, and then of course play Louisville here on the road in the non-conference as well. They do play, of course, Louisville every year because that's their rivalry game, and then you look at the losses coming to Kentucky last year in the SEC. They lost on the road at Georgia, Missouri here at home, Tennessee at home, Alabama at home, and then, of course, South Carolina here on the road in the SEC as well. So Kentucky had a pretty tough schedule last year in the SEC when you had to play Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee, possibly the top three teams last year in the SEC. That was definitely a very tough, schedule for Kentucky. But let's now look ahead to 2024. And here is that schedule for the Wildcats for the upcoming season. Before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Kentucky will play in the non-conference this upcoming season. So this is their non-conference schedule. They will play Southern Miss, Ohio, Murray State, and then, of course, play Louisville here at home. And again, they do play Louisville every year. It's not like really they play them like every single 2 years. They do play them every single year because that's their rivalry game in the Governor's Cup. But you look at this non-conference schedule, not a very tough non-conference schedule once again for Kentucky in 2024. And it's kind of similar to last year, except they do play Louisville here. But again, the good news about this game is that you get them at home, and you have beaten Louisville now for the last 5 years. So Kentucky, a pretty easy schedule for 2024 in the non-conference. Let's now go back to the schedule here for 2024 and go game by game now here for Kentucky. So they will kick things off, of course, with Southern Miss here on August 31st, and then after that they open up SEC play here rather early here in the month of September. They do play South Carolina here at home on September the 7th. Then it's a big matchup here against Georgia on September the 14th. So they do play two SEC games to start out the year here in the first 3 weeks of the season, or I should say the first 2 weeks of the SEC play. And then it's back at home here once again against Ohio here, the other non-conference game on September the 21st. Then they go on the road to face Ole Miss here on the road on September the 28th for their first true road games. So Kentucky will play 4 straight home games, and then they go on the road to face Ole Miss here at the end of the month of September. And then they get their first bye week here of the season. They get a bye week before playing Vanderbilt here at home on October the 12th, and then they go on the road to face Florida here on October 19th. And then it's back at home here against Auburn on October 26th. And then they get to the month of November. They'll play on the road here at Tennessee on November 2nd. Then they get their second bye week here in the second weekend of the month of November. They come out of the bye week, though. It's a really weird spot for a bye week. They do play Murray State coming out of the bye week here on November 16th. And then they go on the road to face Texas here on November 23rd, one of the newcomers coming up in the SEC. And then, of course, end things out, of course, with Louisville here on November 30th in the Governor's Cup rivalry and rivalry weekend of the college football season. So that's the schedule for Kentucky in 2024. A pretty tough schedule. You don't really have a tough non-conference schedule, but you do have a pretty tough SEC schedule. You got Georgia on here. You got Ole Miss on the road, Florida here on the road, Tennessee on the road, and then Texas on the road. Yeah, it's a pretty tough schedule, but it's not really that bad. If they did have, one of those non-conference games, if they had a tough non-conference game, this schedule would definitely be brutal. But let's get to the projection now here for Kentucky for 2024. And again, this is not my official prediction. This is simply a projection based on how tough the schedule is. And this is the scale I use here once again for my projections. If it's a 1% game, that percentage is counted as an automatic loss here when we do these projections. 20% games in the orange are going to be games where Kentucky will be about a couple touchdowns of underdogs. 40% games in the yellow are going to be games where there'll be a slight underdog and also by a touchdown at 40% here in the yellow. 50-50 games will, of course, stay in the white. Games, I think, can go either way. And then 60% games here in the purple, they'll be favored by at least a touchdown in some of these games. And then, of course, 80% games here in the blue, they'll be favored by a couple touchdowns and also by double digits. And then 99% games here in the green. These are pretty much the automatic wins here when we do these projections as well. And they're also going to be favored by more than 3 touchdowns. So we'll start with those easy wins here for Kentucky in 2024. And we'll start with the 99% games here, the automatic wins for Kentucky. And I think you've got 3 automatic wins here for Kentucky: Southern Miss, Ohio, and Murray State. I think all 3 of these non-conference games, Kentucky will be favored by at least over 95% and also by more than 3 touchdowns. They should go out there and take care of business in all 3 of these games. So I think, all these games are at least over 95%. I don't really expect any competitiveness. Maybe Ohio and Southern Miss are 2 teams that can at least compete with Kentucky for a while, but Murray State is definitely a game that's over 95%. I don't really see Murray State competing with Kentucky. But like I said, I think Kentucky will be favored by more than 3 touchdowns in all 3 of these games. And we do these projections, it's counted as an automatic win here, but again, it's not a guaranteed win, but Kentucky will be favored, I believe, in all 3 of these games by more than 3 touchdowns. And again, all these games are counted as automatic wins when we do these projections. So let's now go to the blue games. The games where Kentucky will be favored by a couple touchdowns and also by double digits here at 80%. And I got one game here, and that's in the SEC. That's Vanderbilt here at home on October the 12th. I think Kentucky will be favored here by double digits against the Condors, even though, Vanderbilt beat Kentucky a couple years ago at Commonwealth Stadium, or I should say at Kroger Field. But I think Kentucky will be favored by a couple touchdowns. I think Kentucky is definitely the more talented team. They're the more experienced team, perhaps, maybe as well. I just don't know how good Vanderbilt's going to be either. So I think Kentucky will be favored by a couple touchdowns in this game. If it was on the road at Vanderbilt in Nashville, I definitely would put this game in the purple, but I'm going to go with it and put it in the blue here for Kentucky. I don't have any purple games. Speaking of those purple games, I don't have any on here for Kentucky. Let's go to the games now where they're going to be underdogs in. I don't have any red games either. So let's go to the games now where Kentucky will be about a couple touchdowns of underdogs. And those 2 games on here are Georgia and Texas here in the orange at 20%. So I think Kentucky will be about a couple touchdowns of underdogs in both of these games. I know Georgia is a home game. It should be in the yellow, but how the game went last year, we can just tell you that Kentucky was not on Georgia's level. Georgia just absolutely dominated Kentucky. The offense just was too much for Kentucky's defense to handle. And with that being said, based off of that, game from last year, I think Kentucky playing at home will be about a couple touchdowns of underdogs against the Bulldogs. And then Texas here on the road, that's a very tough road game, a very tough place to play there in Austin. We don't know how good Texas is going to be in their first year in the conference, but this is overall going to be a very talented team and a more talented team than Kentucky is. So I think Kentucky in these couple games here in the orange, I think there'll be about a couple touchdowns of underdogs in both of them. Let's go to the next percentage now. The game's at 40% here in the yellow, where there'll be a slight touchdown of an underdog here and also a heavy underdog here as well. And that one game on here is Ole Miss here on the road on September the 28th. I think Kentucky will be a slight underdog here against the Rebels, even though Ole Miss has not really been good on the defensive side of the football over the years. But this team is absolutely loaded with talent on the offensive side of the football. It could be a shootout here between these 2 teams. I'm not saying that Kentucky is going to lose this game and not saying they're going to win it, but Kentucky does have a pretty good chance to compete in this game. And they also have a chance to go on the road and defeat Ole Miss. And like I said, I don't think they're going to do that and not saying they're going to win it. So again, Kentucky I think will be a slight underdog here against Ole Miss. If it was at home for Kentucky, I definitely would put it as a 50-50 game. But again, I'm going to stick with it here and put it in the yellow just because it's on the road here for the Wildcats. So again, that's the only game that I see Kentucky being a slight underdog in. And then the rest of the 5 games here, South Carolina, Florida, Auburn, Tennessee, and Louisville. These are all 50-50 games for me for Kentucky. I think they can go either way. South Carolina and Kentucky have had some really good recent matchups in the past. And then you look at Florida. Obviously, Kentucky has owned Florida now in the last couple years, but playing on the road, that's still a very tough place to play, and I think Kentucky and Florida is still a 50-50 game. And then, of course, Auburn, I think that's a pretty even matchup there. Tennessee on the road, that's a rivalry game. You never know what can happen. And then, of course, Louisville, the same thing with Tennessee. That's also another rivalry game. You never know what can happen. Even though Kentucky has beaten Louisville now in the last 5 years, I still think it's a really good 50-50 matchup. So all 5 of these games, I think Kentucky does have like 5 50-50 games here that can go either way. Let's say they probably win all their home games and then lose those 2 road games. Maybe they can win all 3 of their home games and then, of course, lose those 2 games on the road at Florida and Tennessee. But I think they have a pretty good chance to win them all. So let's now get a projected record here for Kentucky in 2024. And again, like I said, this is not my official prediction. This is simply a projection based on how tough this schedule is. So we count those 3 green games as automatic wins. Then you count that 1 blue game as a slight win. Then you average out the 20% games here in the orange at 20%. And then you average out that 1 yellow game at 40%. And then you average out all these 50-50 games here at 50%. And the overall projected record that you get for Kentucky is 7-5 here for 2024. So a 7-5 projection here for the Wildcats. I think that's a pretty fair projection for Kentucky. I know it's not like the best projection, but again, based on this schedule, that's how the projected record came out to be 7-5. But also a better projection compared to last year. My last year's projection for Kentucky was 5-7, just because the schedule was very tough. But again, a 7-5 projection here for Kentucky this season. I think best case scenario would definitely be probably 8-4. It wouldn't really shock me if this team did go 8-4. The worst case, I think, would definitely be 6-6 or 5-7. If this team does go 6-6, that definitely would probably be a disappointment for Kentucky in 2024. But again, a 7-5 projection here for Kentucky in 2024. Let me guys know what you think about the Kentucky Wildcats in 2024. What do you think their projected record is for 2024 as well? And thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned here for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports Channel.